Mr. Crashaw, that's the last you'll hear from me. Yes, sir, I'm tired of wasting my breath. I'll talk to you no more.
Oh, it wouldn't do you any good if you did talk. I wouldn't listen to you anyway.
Well, you don't think I listen to you, do you?
Oh, shut up. You make too much noise.
Don't you tell me to shut up.
I will, too.
You won't.
I will.
No, you won't.
Well, I guess it's time to introduce the only man who can ever settle an argument around here, our senior colleague, Dr. S.I. Hayakawa.
Perhaps the trouble with both you men, Mr. Crashaw, Mr. Fudley, is that you talk too much. And every time you introduce me on this program, you get into a fight about it. And I'm going to complain to the director. And if you don't get over this terrible habit you have, I'm going to see to it that you're fired. You understand? Okay. Maybe you ought to listen pretty carefully this time, too, because what I'm going to suggest today is the possibility of your doing very much less talking and more listening, because the subject of my remarks today is going to be the task of the listener. And the basic question to which I'm going to address myself is this. Why is it that some communications are welcomed and acted upon gladly, and why is it that other communications are ignored and sometimes even rejected vigorously?
Hey, if you ask me, that's a silly question.
You forget I am not speaking to you.
Oh, who cares? All I wanted to say was that it seems to me the answer to the doc's question is obvious. He wants to know why we don't pay attention to some communications. Well, it's either because they don't make sense or because they don't fit a guy's way of thinking. Or maybe you'd call it his personality.
You're quite right, Crashaw. It has to do with personality. It has to do with the structure of a personality, why it is that some communications are accepted and welcomed and some communications are rejected. And in order to discuss this matter of the relationship of personality to the problem of communication, I would like to submit to you a theory of personality. First of all, there's the old cliche to the effect that self-preservation is the first law of life. And preachers are fond of pointing to the self-sacrificing behavior of saints and heroes and saying that self-preservation is not the first law of life, that there's something grander in human nature than that. Well, you don't have to point to saints and heroes, really, to show the inadequacy of the notion of self-preservation. There are all sorts of other forms of human behavior that cannot be accounted for in those terms. First of all, for example, there's the man who is working his head off and developing himself stomach ulcers trying to acquire his 20th $1 million. And what he's working for, no one knows. It's just that self-preservation obviously has no more to do with it. Then there are the office girls who go without lunch in order to make payments on a fur coat they can't afford. Self-preservation obviously has little to do with this, since obviously lunch is essential, at least I think so, to self-preservation. And then there are these people who enter the 500-mile races on Memorial Day at Indianapolis. There are the people who want to go over Niagara Falls in a barrel. And then there are the people who want to try to cross the Pacific Ocean in a balsa wood raft. Obviously, self-preservation has little to do with the motivations of people in situations of this kind. Of course, it applies to me, too. I find, for example, that I spend, I should say, $50, $75 a year on fishing equipment. And what do I get? About 79 cents worth of perch. Now, these complex human behaviors can be understood if we think not in terms of preservation of the self, but in terms of preservation of what I shall call self-concept. And in order to explain what I mean by that, I'd like to go to the blackboard and diagram a few things. First of all, let me put on the blackboard a sort of free-flowing figure of vague outline like this. And let us say that this is the self. I represent the self, that is yourself or mine, in a fluid diagram because we are constantly changing. We are not the same from day to day, from year to year, or even from moment to moment. We are undergoing changes of emotion, changes of knowledge, changes of health, changes in age. And therefore, the fluid diagram represents the fluidity, which is the totality of ourselves throughout our lives. Somewhat more stable than the self, however, is what I shall call the self-concept, which I shall represent by a little diagram. The self-concept is what we know or think we know about ourselves. The self-concept, in a technical definition given by Carl Rogers, is an organized configuration of perceptions of the self admissible to awareness. Let me repeat that phrase by phrase so we can get this straight. An organized configuration of perceptions of the self admissible to awareness. The self-concept, that is. Perceptions of the self, that is what we know about ourselves. It's an organized configuration of perceptions of the self. And by that I mean that what we know about ourselves we tend to organize in some kind of pattern. And this patterning of our self-perceptions I represent by the regular geometrical figure with which I've represented the self-concept. The simple way of understanding this is the fact that because we organize what we know about ourselves, we feel organized to ourselves in spite of the fact that to our friends and relatives we may look completely disorganized. But to ourselves we feel organized, and this diagram represents this fact. And another fact about the self-concept is the inclusion of the expression admissible to awareness in Carl Rogers' definition. Perception, there are facts about the self, like buried memories, like hidden anxieties, like forgotten experiences or repressed feelings, which lie way down in our unconscious. They are not part of the self-concept. We are not even aware that we have them because we've hidden them from ourselves for so long. And so there's always the area of the unconscious, which is also a factor in our behavior, but nevertheless they're not part of the self-concept. They're not included in what we know about ourselves. I've deliberately made the figure of the self-concept fall outside the self over here a little bit. And this is to represent the fact that in perceiving ourselves, in talking to ourselves about ourselves, there's always a margin of error involved. Sometimes a man may say, I'm a born leader, and he may not have any qualities of leadership. Nevertheless, he says that to himself, and it's part of his self-concept. Other people may say, nobody loves me, nobody can love me, and of course this is manifestly untrue, and this is why we call such a situation an inferiority complex. Now, we act in the interests not of our total selves, but we act in the interests of our self-concept. And what I'm trying to say, in a sense, is that the self-concept is a greater determinant of the way in which we act and behave and see and receive the world than the totality of the self can possibly be. And so let me put this in the form of a generalization, that the main purpose of the human organism is not preservation of the self, but it is to protect, maintain, and enhance, as I say, not the self, but the self-concept.
Just a moment, my dear doctor, if I may interrupt. Who in blazes are we if we are not who we think we are?
Yeah. So maybe I'm Marilyn Monroe, and my best friends won't tell me, huh? You're not making sense, Doc.
You know, Doctor, I think he has a point there.
Well, maybe you do, Crashaw. You said that you're Marilyn Monroe and your best friends don't tell you. Let me diagram this for you. This, then, would be yourself. And your self-concept is that you're Marilyn Monroe. In other words, your self-concept bears no relationship to the self. You realize, Crashaw, this is practically a definition of insanity.
See?
Now, who's talking to you, Nosey? You see, Doc, I'm the kind of a guy who knows just where he stands and what he believes. And I tell you, you're not making sense. And nothing you can say will make me change my mind. Do you understand?
I understand. What you're saying is that you're so completely convinced and rigid in your belief that you are Marilyn Monroe that nothing can change your mind. In other words, what you have is what the psychiatrists call a systematized set of delusions.
Oh!
Now, let's go on to apply this whole idea of the self-concept to the problem of communication. And let me remind you what our basic question is. Why is it that some communications are welcomed, and why is it that some communications are ignored or even rejected vigorously? Let us imagine, then, here two cells. Here is Mr. A with his self-concept, and over here, let us say, is Mr. B with his self-concept. And let's assume for the moment that it is Mr. A's task to communicate a set of orders, instructions, advice, directive, or something to Mr. B, and let's represent the communication by a line. Now, it happens to be a kind of psychological rule that we tend to rigidify the self-concept whenever we are experiencing feelings of threat. Let's assume, for the purpose of our illustration, that something in Mr. A's message is threatening to Mr. B. He doesn't like the message, or perhaps he just doesn't like the tone of voice in which Mr. A delivered it. However, let's assume that the message is slightly threatening. And therefore, Mr. B, instead of saying, "Yes, sir," he says something like, "Oh, yeah?" In other words, rejecting it. And he tightens up against the message slightly. When this happens, Mr. A feels the implied criticism of the rejection of his message. In other words, this is a criticism either of Mr. A or of his message, and this criticism is a slight threat to Mr. A. And feeling this criticism, Mr. A may in turn tighten up slightly, like this. Rigidify is the term. The first attempt at communicating having failed, Mr. A will, of course, try again. And in order to penetrate Mr. B's defenses, then, he will perhaps communicate the message perhaps a little louder this time, to be sure that Mr. B will understand. Since Mr. B already feels threatened by Mr. A's message, or by Mr. A himself, instead of yielding to this additional pressure, he will tighten up even more. And again, reject the message. And of course, this rejection will in turn have an effect on Mr. A's feelings, so that this sense of rejection will tend to fortify his rigidity and his defenses too. As you can see, this process can go on. Let's say that Mr. A tries a third time. This time, he not only shouts it, but let us say he says it in words of one syllable, so that Mr. B will be sure to understand the message this time. And Mr. B, hearing the message in words of one syllable, feels not only the additional verbal pressure, but may even feel that his own educational level is being criticized, so he puts up even more powerful defenses against A's message, which in turn are felt by Mr. A as a criticism of his message or himself, and Mr. A tightens up too. And very soon you get into a condition which might be called communicative deadlock, in which there may be further exchange of words for minutes or hours or days between A and B. There may be many exchanges of words, but there'll be no exchange of communication, because each feels extremely threatened by the mere presence of the other. And as you look at a diagram like this, I wonder if you are reminded, as I am, of an event in recent history in which this principle is illustrated so beautifully, namely the truce negotiations at Panmunjom, which, as you remember, lasted for months and months. And why did they last for so long? Well, it's obvious, isn't it? The negotiators from the United Nations forces and the negotiators from the North Korean forces, they must have felt a tremendous threat in each other's presence. And therefore, talking continued for months and months, but no communication took place. And this is an example, then, of communicative deadlock.
Hey, you know something? There may be something in what he says after all.
Everything that you say is just further proof that you are an idiot.
Ah, you remind me of a horse I bet on once. It died at the post.
Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never touch me.
Listen, you two. It's exactly what I'm talking about, communicative deadlock. Every time you open your mouth, Crashaw, Fuddley doesn't listen. When you talk, Fuddley, Crashaw doesn't listen. The thing is just deadlocked like this, and this is just precisely the point I'm getting at. And if you listen carefully, what I want to try to explain next is how such a deadlock is broken up, or how it can be avoided if you can see it coming. And here I'd like to introduce another technical term from the writings of Dr. Carl Rogers. And the term is non-evaluative listening. And Dr. Rogers' prescription under these circumstances is that if A finds it impossible to get through a message to B, what A should do is temporarily to suspend his purposes, and instead of trying to get through to B, to permit B to get through to A. In other words, A should find out from B how the world looks to him, why he objects to the proposal or directive or suggestion, what kind of information B has that makes it necessary for him to reject A's proposal. This means then non-evaluative listening on the part of A to everything that B has to say in objection to what A had to say originally. Now let's assume this takes place. Non-evaluative listening means listening fully in order to understand rather than keeping quiet while you think up arguments to mow him down with later on. Listening means trying to enter into the frame of reference of the other fellow. So let's assume that A seriously tries to listen, not to pass judgment and say that's good or bad, but simply in order to understand. And this is what is meant by non-evaluative. So B starts to get his messages across. Now, anybody who is being patiently and understandingly listened to becomes less rigid, because he's not fighting to defend his position, he's just explaining it. And therefore, if B finds his messages getting across, what automatically happens is that his own boundaries of rigidity begin to relax. And because his rigidity begins to relax, the kinds of statements he makes begin to change in character. Instead of stating things dogmatically and fiercely, he says them calmly and reasonably. And because now B is making calm and reasonable statements, B himself finds himself relaxing under the diminution of the pressures upon him. And it's an interesting thing, since communication is a process of social interaction, since how one person feels is reflected in how the other person feels, there tends to develop a kind of beneficent cycle in which the progressive relaxation of one reflects itself in the relaxation of the other. And ultimately, what can happen is this. If you go on the theory, as I do, that every human being in the world knows something that other people do not know, then what will happen ultimately is that Mr. B will manage to communicate to Mr. A some facts, some ideas, some objections, some circumstances that Mr. A did not know about, or was ignoring, or had forgotten about at the time. And as a result of the successful communication of this additional information from B to A becomes A plus, a slightly better informed person than he was before the communication started. If this is so, then, and both parties now are feeling reasonably relaxed, Mr. B may very well say, well, what was that The suggestion you were making to me earlier, why did you make it? And because he is relaxed, Mr. A now has a chance to restate his original message. But notice that Mr. A plus is not quite the same person as Mr. A, and therefore the message is going to be slightly different. And Mr. B, instead of fighting back now because he feels non-threatened, will say, tell me more about it. And so ultimately, Mr. A will communicate to Mr. B certain ideas, facts, circumstances, and so on, information, which will increase Mr. B's store of knowledge and information, as a result of which he develops into Mr. B plus. And this then is the goal of communication, is that we should enrich each other by giving to each other the content of what we know and what we believe, so that each of us comes away from a communication richer than we did when we sat down. And of course the whole point of this is that perhaps Mr. A plus and B plus together can solve problems that Mr. A and B together could not solve.
Hey, do you suppose it really works?
Well, I don't know. It might.
Yeah. Say, are you thinking what I'm thinking?
Well, possibly. I was just thinking that perhaps we should give it a try. This non-evaluative listening, I mean.
Yeah. I was sort of thinking the same thing. But you gotta listen first.
Now, see here. All right, Crashaw. What do you have to say?
Well, it's like this. A little while ago, I kind of called you a dead horse. Well, maybe you're not a dead horse after all.
You know, Crashaw, I seem to recall saying that you were an idiot. Perhaps you're not as much of an idiot as I thought you were.
Well, I'll let that pass. You want to know why? I'll tell you. I keep thinking about that Panmunjom thing. There's not much chance of anything happening when one side won't listen to what the other has to say. Not much, except a fight, that is.
Crashaw, I think I see what the doctor's been talking about.
Yeah, he puts it funny, but I think I know what he means, too.
Gosh, I'm glad you fellows are getting the point. Gee, really do you get it, Crashaw?
You say, Doc.
I do hope so. I really do hope so.
Well, thanks.
Well, now see if you can carry this out.
Yeah.
I really, to be very frank, you know, I really don't trust you. And I'm afraid you're going to be quarreling again. But I just want to see if I can get the point across to you by one more example. Let me go over to the desk and read you something here that may nail down the whole point for you. Let me see where it is. In order to give an illustration both of what you and Crashaw are doing and also to give an illustration of this whole process of one-way communication with a tremendous preoccupation with getting your point across, let's read this little dramatization of what might happen at an American breakfast table any morning. Here, let us say, is a mother trying to get her boy off to school. She says, all right now, time to get going. And the boy says, Mommy, I don't want to walk. I want Daddy to drive me. Now hurry and get your coat on and get going, or else you'll be late. I don't want to walk, Mommy. How silly. It's fun to walk. I want Daddy to drive me. But he hasn't time to drive you this morning, and you have plenty of time to walk. But I don't like to walk, Mommy. How silly. It's a beautiful morning, and you have lots of fun. No. You can walk with Billy across the street. No. Or by yourself. No. Now, there's nothing the matter with you. You're a big boy now. No. Now, stop this nonsense at once and get going. Walk. Do you understand? Now, what you notice about this little dialogue is that there's no curiosity on the part of the mother whatsoever as to the reasons why the child doesn't want to walk. You can think of any number yourself if you're an experienced parent. Is there a new baby in the family so that the boy feels displaced and wants to be reassured that he's loved? Has he been in a fight at school so that he wants a little boost in morale before he faces that school again? These are questions that will occur to you, and perhaps if the mother put her hand upon the boy's head, might discover that he has a temperature of 103. in which case there'll be no question of his walking.
Hey, Doc, can I give the commercial now?
Why, sure.
Okay, just a minute. Yeah. You know, I got a book here called Language in Thought and Action, and it was written by Dr. S.I. Hayakawa. Wonder who he is? Anyway, it's got the straight dope from on his talking and listening stuff, you know. What I mean is, it's a good book, see, and you ought to read it. How's that, Doc?
Thank you, Crashaw. And while we're on the subject of literature, let me recommend some other books to your attention. First of all, let me call to your attention Client-Centered Therapy by Carl Rogers and Elaine Dorfman, Thomas Gordon, and Nicholas Hobbs. Is based largely on experiences in psychotherapy, but the additional chapters contributed by others talk about the importance of this kind of communicative theory with respect to education and with respect to business management and other such subjects. And so this is a very, very important book to have. Also, in the case of individual behavior, the theory of personality presented in this book is that on which my diagram of self-concept is based. And Donald Snigg of Oswego State Teachers College and Arthur W. Combs of Syracuse University are the authors. You will find this a most useful book in explaining not only communication, but many other facets of the human personality and the way it is put together and the way it changes because of experience or because of pressure. And also this book, Self-Consistency by Prescott Leckie. This book is written by a man who died in 1941 at a very early age. He seems to have achieved little success in academic life and in his profession, but after he died, his collected papers were put together by his wife, and he has achieved a considerable fame because of the profound influence he had upon the development of a theory of personality and upon a theory of communication. My final point that I'd like to make is that communication is not a one-way process, but necessarily a two-way process. Unless you listen as well as speak, no possibility of communication can exist. Well, it's been a great pleasure to be with you, and I look forward to seeing you on the next of this series of programs.
This is National Educational Television.